Welcome back, everyone. I'm here again with Sean McFate. We're going to talk about the next phases of the Ukrainian conflict. So, just to level set, it is May 31st. The latest I know is that the Ukrainians had a successful uh, operation that pushed the Russians out of Kharkiv. At the same time, the Russians started or have been pounding Severe Donetsk in much smaller pieces and segments, and they're seeing some success for once, and which makes sense given the terrain of that environment, which is extremely flat and plays to Russia's strength in artillery and ranging and things like that. And then lastly, I believe there was another small counteroffensive by the Ukrainians that they started over the weekend in kind of the southwestern Ukraine. I can't remember the exact city, but they, I think, successfully staged a river crossing and were pushing the Russians back. It was near Kherson. So with that, where's this thing gonna end up?
So this is our crystal ball moment. Is that right, Sean? We're gonna look in and pick
By the way, I'm not gonna show another best hits at the very beginning of this. But I did predict Severodonetsk on a different different episode. You weren't on that one, but I've been saying that one for a while.
All right, good. So here's what I think is going to happen. We're really asking what's going to happen this summer in Russia, Ukraine, leading into the end of the year. And then what's going to happen in the region and others. And I think from where I sit right now, which is the end of May, 2022, that Russia is shifted. It's lifted and shifted its strategy. It tried conventional war. It was hilariously unsuccessful. And the whole world is like, oh my God, we thought these people were so tough. And, but that aside, they've shifted their strategy into this. It's going to be a bloody war of attrition. They're going to engage more in heavy-handedness, where human rights violations become not a bug but a feature of their warfare. If you look at the general they've put in charge, whose name I can never pronounce on spec, you remember? Dvornikov, yeah. Who led this series? He's a veteran of the Chechen Wars, which was particularly brutal, and was responsible for the heavy-handedness in Syria, where the Wagner Group, specifically in Syria, tortured and killed, terrorists, everybody. But the collateral damage was high. They flattened cities, and they did this in Grozny. So I think collateral damage, war of attrition as a way to bring pain to the Ukrainian government, so they finally submit and say, okay, we'll go to the peace table, but Russia has the upper hand. So I think that's what Russia's strategic aim is going to be, and Russia is betting that the West will not intervene in a direct way and allows Russia to cook Ukraine and skin them alive.
This is actually why I'm a little surprised by the way the Biden administration is handling this. So I think so far they deserve an A- in terms of how they've handled this conflict thus far. I would say they were a little slow in the beginning to react and to supply the Ukrainians, but they quickly overcame it with alacrity. We gave them the equipment that they needed. Here's where they're starting to kind of edge into like B-, C+ territory. Right now, the Russians have effectively a blockade in the Black Sea. If I were in charge, I would immediately be working with the UN. In fact, I've reached out to a friend at the UN and said, why aren't you guys doing this? But I would start working through the UN and NATO to establish an escort program so that under a US flag or under a NATO flag or a UN flag, you have a convoy system that goes into the Black Sea, escorts grain shipments, because grain is the key, out of the Black Sea. Otherwise, you're going to have a massive humanitarian crisis come the fall, and it's going to be in the Middle East. It's going to be in Africa. It's going to cause a massive amount of civil unrest and disorder, and you're going to have in the West, you're going to have further food inflation. And what is astonishing to me is that like people kind of see this slow moving train wreck, and they're not doing something that they can easily do. Now, I know the possibility or potential of escalation goes way up, but if you just say, look, this is a humanitarian issue and we're coming and we're going to steam forward. If you get within 1,000 feet of one of our vessels, we're going to sink your Navy, which we can easily do given Russian performance, at least the performance that we've seen. I know that's provocative and it's intentionally
I like
provocative.
You know me. I think if DC had more provocative of the right sort, we'd actually get more solutions. We're provocative of the third grade sort. That's the difference. But I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, here's my concerns is that Russia wants to manufacture a humanitarian crisis. They're weaponizing humanitarian crises, right? Not just in Ukraine, but around the world.
Exactly. So they have leverage.
So they have leverage because if countries like Brazil and the Middle East, like Lebanon and others, start having, starvation, which leads to civil unrest, that leads to bigger problems in those regions, they're gonna lean on the U.S. and NATO to say stop it. Also, right now the sanctions. First of all, Sean, more than most, that sanctions are a very blunt instrument,
right?
And that sanctions take a long time to bite, but also there are sanction runners, just like blockade runners. And it's really hard to keep countries like Hungary, as we've seen recently, Hungary, Germany, France, Italy, Austria, who have vested business interests in Russia, especially of energy. They can defect at some point. And come the fall, when it starts getting cold again, and all this has been simmering for 6 months, the Western alliance that, the US and Biden have carefully put together and they get an A- for, may start to fracture and crumble. And then, Russia's, I think they get the A- all of a sudden. So, yeah. So I think Russia has a plan here.
Exactly. And they always do. That's what's so frustrating because as they were slowly building up their natural gas assets and the Germans were decommissioning nuclear power plants, it was very obvious what Putin was trying to do because he's not a dumb guy. In fact, my view of what happened in the North is he was just fed a bunch of BS by his intelligence people, and his mistake was believing it.
Well, they may be dead now, but yes.
Yeah, well, and they probably should be. Yeah. Well, but the issue though is, or not the issue, where he deserves high marks is his willingness and unabashed shamelessness in just pivoting, right? Like if that were the U.S. military and we had a mess up like that, we would continue to throw bodies at the problem. I mean, we would do it a little bit more intelligently, but we would continue. I shouldn't say bodies. We would continue to throw resources at the problem.
Resources, yeah.
Until we solve it. Like if the U.S. had conducted this invasion the same way, there would still be U.S. forces out, pushing toward Kiev, right, or Kyiv. So he deserves high marks for after 2 weeks or whatever, a month, saying this isn't working. Let's narrow the scope, and he did. And then Kharkiv failed. He narrowed the scope again.
Yeah.
And now things are starting to work. And the one thing I've always said is the Russians may be incompetent and corrupt, but they always learn. Always.
Well, we have to remember that the Russians fight dirty, and dirty can sometimes work. And that's something we have to get our strategic minds around. So to your question about like the UN convoy, here's why I'm skeptical. I think it's a great idea, but here's why. And I say this having worked alongside several UN missions in Africa, and working alongside in New York City and Geneva, particularly the Department of Peacekeeping.
And also, to be clear, I'm not saying the U.S. should.
I know you're not advocating
the UN
this,
should.
It's a good, but it's a good.
Well, no, what I would advocate is the U.S. does it. The U.S. does it. They just find the most legitimate way to do it is to have a UN like cover for it. And if that doesn't work, an EU cover. And if that doesn't work, a NATO cover. And if that doesn't work, we just do it.
Maybe a NATO cover, but then you have other issues. But like, so if you did the UN, first of all, a couple structural bureaucratic reasons why is that, you know, Russia would veto it on the Security Council. Second of all, is that the UN, the Department of Peacekeeping, is not built for this. They are, you know, whatever they, I don't think they would say they are, but what they've turned into is a large, fat blob that sits on a grid square in Africa and sucks in lots of money and does very little and says they're doing peacekeeping. So this idea of, now maybe you could do something like, was it Task Force 151? You remember the international task force that against the Somali pirates in 2011 or 12?
Oh, yeah.
So that might be a better model, because then you have like an international naval task force that is not working for an international organization. There was Japan, there was America, there were some other countries involved. And they, you know, did some stuff. And, you know, could we do that? So you can't bring NATO. Once you bring NATO into it, you're risking, you know, World War III.
You have two potential combatants, right?
That's right. So if you have some sort of international task force, say led by Japan, like led by a party that's not party to this, and Japan right now is looking to flex its military muscle for the first time in 70 years. And so there's maybe some political appetite in Japan. I don't want to speak too loudly for Japan right now, but you know, we're just
maybe Australia. Maybe I guess they're part of the Five Eyes. So
or somebody who's not beholden to Russia, but doesn't have a dog in the fight in Europe either. And so, you know, could they do it? If you have American ships there, then you're risking World War III. It's like the same problem with the no-fly zone, because if it's challenged and, you know, an Arleigh Burke destroyer goes to the bottom of the Black Sea, then what, right? Then what happens?
That just gives us the excuse we need to sink the Russian Navy.
Well, but you know, then it could be it could be nuclear, though. I mean, when does it? How long does it take to go nuclear? You know, it's
so my view on this has always been about 10 times more aggressive than the U.S., like the official U.S. policy, and that's for this reason. Putin already did something that's completely and utterly provocative, which is invade Ukraine. Like, it's completely unacceptable. And we didn't nuke him. So I think my view is, as long as you go in there and you say, look, we don't aim to sink your ships. We're just here to make sure that the grain supplies get out. If you do engage with us, we will destroy everything you have in Ukraine, but we'll go no further. Or, you know, at least, let's say the Black Sea, and then that could, if it were to escalate, we will go no further than Ukraine. But keep in mind, I think the Russians understand now that we could wipe out their military in a very, at least in Ukraine, in a very short period of time. Conventional military.
Yeah.
And they know we don't want to use nukes. We know they don't want to use nukes, but despite their rhetoric. In fact, there have been public statements recently that they have no intention of using tactical nukes in the conflict. Now, to be fair, if we got involved conventionally, that might go out the window. Because I think that's why they've come to their senses on that rhetoric, because they know if they use conventional nukes, we would get involved. Not conventional nukes, tactical nukes.
Yeah.
So, but my point is, to your point, people aren't playing this thing out a year out, because you're exactly right. Not only do you have the grain issue with the inflation and things like that, but you're also going to have energy inflation and Russia's going to have more leverage when it starts to get cold again. And you're going to have defectors like the Germans, maybe not so much the French, because they were smart enough to keep nuclear power plants and the strong nuclear industry. But you're going to have people that want to defect when the cold comes around. Mm-hmm. And I think it's absolutely critical that we do something. But I actually think your solution, I think we worked out a policy problem, came out with the best solution in real time, which is, you're right, you get a third party to do this. And even like Russia, we'll escort your ships too, so that the Ukrainians don't fire on them, right? Like it'll be like a white flag vessel. It's for both parties. Now Japan, there's some territorial disputes between the Russians and the Japanese. I was
grasping it. Could be somebody. I'm not sure who it would be.
Yeah, and Australians are probably too close to us. Is there anybody else with a navy that?
Sure, we could find somebody.
India, maybe.
India, somebody who wants to be a player in great power politics. So I don't think we'd accept China. They might volunteer.
Yeah, which would be a disaster. But okay, so we get to fast forward to the fall. I think this, to your point, this is where the Russians move more toward this gray zone sort of behavior. Sure. And that is, they do this war of attrition, this hardcore conventional push to gain as much territory as they can, and then they freeze the conflict.
Yeah.
And then what they do is they use this blockade to slowly starve out the Ukrainian economy, or just have it wither on the vine. And then they slowly infest it with their own brand of Russian corruption. They start bribing people.
Sure.
And they affect a political change within Ukraine to get somebody terms that are a little bit more advantageous to them. Like Putin, that's the one thing Putin can't do. He can't just stop. No Russian leader could stop this war. Because,
Putin's ego, nobody knows where his ego ends and foreign policy in Russia begins, right? He is foreign policy. That's why we can't be sure about the nuclear option for Russia, because nobody can really get inside of Putin's head. But, I think what they're going to do is they're going to hold it in place, make it bad, destroy some infrastructure, and then they're going to, come the fall and winter, they're going to invoke Russia's oldest ally, which is winter, and let that do the damage. And they did in 32, 33, or 31, 32. They starved, 6 to 7 million Ukrainians in 6 months. That's about the same number as Jews who died in the Holocaust over 4 years. That was a man-made starvation catastrophe. Some people said it was deliberate. Many people say it was deliberate to, soften Ukraine, who didn't fully get on board to the Bolshevik agenda. And then after that, they did. So they might do some version of that. And what could they live with? Well, I think ideally, if they couldn't take Kiev, one thing they could try to do, if they could take Odessa, they could have basically, Ukraine becomes a landlocked country with, on its west flank is NATO, and everything else is surrounded by Russia. And Russia just has got to lock them in until they capitulate. And that would be a solution, I think, for Russia.
I think that is the only solution that they have right now.
We're not going to call this the final solution, though. Just be clear.
No, but that's what Putin called it. Did you see? Did you actually read his
in his
speech?
denazification agenda? He called this the final solution.
Yeah. No, he used. I mean, I don't know what. That was the translation that was on the official Russian government website. He used. That's how they translated it. So whatever that.
No, it's
maybe something was lost in
perverse. Anyway, yeah. Perverse. But so that's my take on. And I don't know what the West is going to do. I think also because if you think about it, the U.S. is leading this coalition. Look, Poland, Romania, and the Nordic countries are very much pushing as well. But I think the U.S. its own domestic politics, the midterms coming up. We'll see what happens. Even the Republican Party, this idea like $40 billion for Ukraine is very divisive. So, if the U.S. became a soft player in this, I'm not sure how that would impact anything.
What's your take on what's going on in Belarus? You see, they moved. They're going to have not war games, but training on the border.
I think this is. So war at the strategic level is armed politics, and I think this is a strategic level move. It's sort of diplomatic language from Putin to NATO. You call it threats, call it whatever you'd like, but I think he's sending a message, some sort of diplomatic message that infers intent and capability. The one thing he has going against him is that, the West now kind of feels like he's a little bit of a paper bear, because
well, he is.
Yeah.
Aside from nuclear weapons.
Yeah, exactly.
In 1 month, he erased 30 years of my own personal indoctrination on how effective the Russian military was.
Yeah, I mean, you are not alone. The intelligence community is being asked some harsh questions by Congress right now between the Afghanistan debacle last summer and Russian readiness now. There's a lot of people, but I do think that if you're gonna threaten people, as you all know, Sean, you need two things. You need to have the will to actually carry out the threat, and the capacity to carry out the threat. Now, we know he hasn't got the will to potentially carry out the threat, but the capacity now is really in question. And so I don't know how effective any sort of military maneuverings on the border of NATO and Russia, Belarus really could be at this point, with the exception of the nukes.
So you don't think that Putin convinced Belarus, like these military exercises are not a prelude to Belarus entering the war?
It could. I mean, Belarus is a client state of Russia. The war is changing. I think that's all possible, maybe even likely.
Now, do you think Putin's going to do anything to strike out farther? I mean, there's a lot of chatter inside Russia, at least on their television shows and things like that, about getting the U.S. back for, what does that? I mean, is that real?
I think their TV shows are kind of like our TV news shows now too, except that like a week or two ago there was this one retired colonel who just totally blew it, and saying this is not going the way. Yeah, he was honest. So we'll see what happens, or doesn't happen to him from the future. But I think that there's probably some saber rattling, but I don't think that there's much. I mean, I think Putin's options are really quite limited right now. He can play he could basically boil frog slowly strategy, as we've been discussing. I think that's probably his best play. When I say best, I don't mean morally good. I mean, I think if one was to be in his shoes, that's what
it's his maximizing course of action.
I think the whole nuclear thing is, he's got to be very careful about how he uses those in threats. But he is going to probably redline that a little bit. But he says things that I think some of the back channels are negating is what I've heard rumor wise. So that's and also especially Lidov, who is this foreign minister, who's the Putin mini-me, who is the president when Putin was,
Medvedev.
Yes. So Medvedev is like, he's like the like little junkyard dog on a leash in chief, yipping, who says a lot of these things.
Oh, are you talking about, because there's Medvedev, who was like the president for a while.
Yeah. And the foreign minister, I forget too.
And then there's the Chechen guy who's really.
Oh, I'm talking about the Chechen guy is like crazy. No, but like, you have some saber rattling. You see this in China too, and it's just, I don't take that. I just kind of, it's like when I hear crazy talk on CNN or Fox as well. I just kind of dismiss it as crazy talk. And
all this crazy talk about tactical nukes started with Chuck Todd.
I am not surprised.
I was watching Meet the Press, and like out of the blue at the very beginning, he's just like, well, what do you think Putin's going to use tactical nukes? And I'm sitting there, excuse my language, I'm like, what the fuck? Like, right. where the fuck did that come from? Like, it just,
I don't say, but but this is the first time in a generation, like when I joined the army as a young 18-year-old, it was still the Cold War, the very, very, very end of it. But I grew up in an era where nukes were a thing. And then the last 30 years, we've had the privilege of nukes not being a thing. And suddenly we have to recalibrate. And I think the world does as well. And there are many young people who have never lived under this terror of a nuclear threat. And Russia, worst case scenario, I assume it could look something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it can get 0 to 1 million within 30 minutes. Now, with that, we make some assumptions that they've done maintenance on their nuclear fleet, all that stuff. But leaving all that aside, we don't want to gamble that they haven't done good maintenance. So I think it's a new era for international relations, and it's not a neo-Cold War. I think that frame does more damage than good, because there's a lot of differences. But we have early 21st century. We're now living with the potential of a nuclear war in our lifetime. And I think, will there be, who will be the first to unleash the nuclear taboo that was set after Hiroshima? And that's a good question for all of us to think about. And then once that taboo is broken, what follows thereafter? Do other countries feel now that they can do nukes? India, Pakistan, or China and its neighbors, or goodness knows in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. That lateral escalation could happen quickly there.
Well, fortunately, at least as far as I know, the Saudis and the Iranians don't have nukes yet.
Well, it's possible. And I wrote my second novel about this possibility, Deep Black, is that Saudi Arabia could potentially buy nukes from Pakistan through a long-standing secret agreement if they needed them. But that's a theory that you can write novels about, but not nonfiction about. But there's been some belief in circles in DC, and there's some disagreement about this, is that when Saudi Arabia gave up its nuclear program, decades ago, they secretly gave a lot of their material and research to Pakistan with the deal that if they ever needed a nuke, they could purchase, one or a dozen or how many ever they needed.
What about China, Taiwan? I think even today they flew, they're flying all their aircraft near and just exhausting the Taiwanese Air Force.
I think, so call me skeptical. I'm one of those people in DC who thinks that this is just kabuki theater, and that, China, if you think Ukraine's, as you would say in the army, a Sierra show for the Russians, magnify that by 10 for China trying to take Taiwan. They're still trying to ingest Hong Kong, right? Mm-hmm. And Taiwan has been ready for this total fight for 70 years. And, a land, they're talking about amphibious invasion of a country, not easy to do. That's what, 100 miles away or so. I don't know how close it is, but it's not easy.
Yeah, it's not. It doesn't look as close as it looks on the map.
It's not like you have a huge land border as Russia did, and I think China has some problems, though. I mean, China, first of all, their military is unproven. There's a lot of saber rattling, but they're unproven military. And second, though, Taiwan, though, has a lot of political corruption in it. And so, one of the things that's magical about Ukraine, which everybody loves, is that those underdogs have a fighting spirit. Zelensky turned out to be a real leader, not just an actor. I'm not sure if that would emerge from Taiwanese leadership, but it is. I do think this idea of China taking Taiwan by force by 2027 as a done deal is foolishness. I don't think it's, for a lot of reasons.
All right. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next, several months as we get to the fall, because the Russians are going to keep sending bodies through the meat grinder, and the Ukrainians are going to start getting worn out and tired. Now, I know they've mobilized like a lot.
Well, the resources are just not. I mean, in some ways, it's like, this is a very crass comparison that your viewers may hate, but in some ways, it's sort of like the U.S. Civil War, the North versus the South. The South were good fighters, but they were the resources. 2/3 of the United States was in the North, and 1/3 was in the South, and they just couldn't sustain it. There's a lot of other things that happened in the Civil War too. But no matter how good you tactically, operationally are, it's just very hard to sustain these things. And I think that's why Russia has moved to a game of attrition, because they know in the long run, and they don't care about throwing humans into the meat grinder to sustain their strategy. So I think, we could do another show in Labor Day and reassess, but I bet that unless there's some strange breakaway diplomacy, it's going to be more of the same.
All right, my friend. I will see you again in the next segment.
All right. Yep.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.